Let's now implement dates in our application. And to see what we have to do, so where we have dates in our application, let's go to our demo here. And so we have the date first here, and then also in all of these movements. So each of them here, besides the deposit and the value itself, like we have it now, we also now need the date here. And so that's the reason why in our account objects, we actually now have the movement dates. It's so that we can display them here. But let's start with this date here. And actually the very first thing that I want to do is to basically fake it that we are always logged in. Okay, so let me do that here. Fake always logged in. And so this way we don't have to always log in each time we want to do something. So to that, let's set the current account to account 1. Then let's call update UI with that current account. And also we need to make the user interface visible with this here. Okay. So these 3 lines will now make it so that Jonas is automatically logged in, except for the message here, but that doesn't really matter. Okay. So as I was saying, let's start by displaying the current balance here. So as I was saying, let's now create this date here. Okay. And let's check out the class name. So that's as always a little bit hidden. So it's the class date. Okay. And so that is already selected at label date. And once more, let's start by setting this date outside here of any callback function so that we can see the effects as we implement our code. So anyway, let's start by creating the current date. And so remember, that is simply by doing new date. And so that is basically right now. However, we don't just want to print that. So let's see how that would look like. So label date, as I have already selected, which again is this element with the class of date, and then text content, and let's set it to now. And so this result here is not exactly what we want, right? So instead, we really only want the day, the month, and the year. And I want to display it in this format. So I want day, then month, and then year. And so this is how we display it in Europe, or at least in Portugal, where I am located. Okay. Now, of course, you can format it in any way that you want. For example, how it looks like in your country, but I will do it like this now. Now, later in this section, we will learn about something called internationalization, which sounds very complicated, but it will allow us to format dates and time according to the user's location, basically. So if the user was in Portugal, then the date would automatically be formatted this way. But if the user was, for example, in the US or in India or wherever, then the date would be formatted in the way that it is usually formatted in that country. All right? So to do this, we need to get the day, month, and year. So let's create variables for each of them. All right. So we take now, and then we call the getDate method, just like we learned in the last video. Then let's take the month, which is now.getMonth. And remember that this one is 0 based. So I'm going to add 1 here. And then the year, which is now .getFullYear. And actually, let's also get the hour and the minute so we can display that as well. So get hours and const the minutes, get minutes. Okay, and now that we have that, all we have to do is to build a nice string with that. So that's the day slash the month slash the year. And then I want a comma and the hour and the minute. So min. All right, and that looks a lot better. Now here in Portugal, whenever the month and the year is only one digit here, then we usually write 08 and 02. So basically we pad this number here with a 0 on the left. All right, so let's do that with the day and with the month, because this is actually a good use case for this method that we studied earlier. So on the day and on the month, we want to use dot pad start. And actually this needs to be a string now. And so let's make it a template literal. Like this. So basically this is now a string. And so on that string, we can call pad start. And then we want this always to be 2 characters long. And we want to pad it with a 0. And probably just writing 0 would work just the same. And so now we get 02. But if the day would be, let's say, 12, then that 0 would not be added because the final length that we're looking for is always 2. Okay, and the same with the month. So let's copy it here. And beautiful. So that looks perfect. And now let's move on to actually use the dates here on the movements. Okay. Just keep in mind that, of course, as the time goes on, this value here is not going to change. So this is static, right? So if we wanted to keep displaying the actual time, we would need something called a timer, which is something that we will do by the end of the lecture. We will not do it for this, but we will implement a timer like this. Maybe you have seen it counting down here. So this logout timer. All right, so this time here is going to stay static, but yeah, that's not a big deal for now. But anyway, let's now go to the function which displays these movements. So display movements. So here it is. All right. And so now besides the movements, we also want to display the times of these movements. But now we actually have a problem, because into this function, we are only passing the movements array itself, right? However, we also want the, let's see, we also want the movement dates. And so the best thing to do is to simply pass in the entire account into this function here as well. So just like we already have it in these two, where we already passed in the entire account, let's do the same here as well. So just the account. And then here we need to say account.movement and here account.movements. And finally, where we call this function, we then need to pass in also the entire account. And so that's here in the display UI function. Okay. And so now it is a good thing that we have this refactored function that we created in the last section, where we call all of these methods here only in one place. And so now we only needed to change calling this display movements function here in this one place. And so that's the whole goal of refactoring. It is making it easier to implement new features as time moves on. All right. So let's see how we could do that. So in here, we are looping over the movements. So that's this array that we compute here, which is whether the sorted movements or simply the movements themselves, right? So we are looping over this, and in each iteration, we are generating this HTML. And so now we simply need to add one more element here to this HTML, which is going to contain that date. So let's do that. So in our HTML, we can see that there is this element here called movements date. So let's copy that and paste it right here after the type. Okay. And so let's actually create a variable out here and then put that variable right here. Let's call it display date. Okay. Now, where is the date actually coming from? Well, as we already know, it is in the accounts.movement dates, right? And so here we are looping over the movements. And so at the same time, basically, we also need to loop over the movement dates. Okay. But that's not a problem because we already have the index here. And so what we can do is to write account or ACC dot movement dates, and then we take it at position I. So that is the current index in the movements array, and the same index is then going to point to the equivalent date in this movements date array. All right. So this is a common technique of looping over two arrays at the same time. So we call the for each method on one of them. So that's the movements. And then we use the current index to also get the data from some other array. Okay. And so that's going to be at the same position because we're using the same index. So let's create a new date out of this, because as we saw before, this is going to be a nicely formatted time string, right? And so we can use that string to create a new date object. And we need that object so that then from there we can call our usual methods to get the date and the month and the year. Okay, so that's the reason why we need to convert these strings back into a JavaScript object, because only then we can actually work with that data. And now let's actually create these same variables that we already have here. So there's no need to repeat it all. Let's actually get all of this and then delete what we don't need to make this a little bit faster. So we don't need the hour and the minute. So we don't need this. And we want to create this variable called display date. So the date that we're ultimately going to use here. Display date. And now here we need to change from now to date like this. All right. And we see it already worked. Great. So let's compare it actually here with the dates. So July 12, 2020. And yeah, that works. Here then we have 11, which for some reason is also 12. But I guess it's because we're close to midnight here. And so for some reason, probably it then changes over to the next day. Then here we have 27 of May. And so that's also what we get here, all the way to the last one, which is 18 of November, so 2019. So this is accurate. Great. Now, when we click here on the sort, it's probably not going to work. So we get some kind of error here. So cannot read property slice of undefined. Let's see why that is. Well, that's weird, because account.movements here is clearly defined. It shouldn't be undefined. Let's set this here to true by default. And so, well, now it is sorted. So very weird that we get this bug as we click here. let's just log to the console. But indeed, this one here will be not undefined. But actually it now is undefined. So we get account.movements is undefined right now. And that's weird. But I guess it has something to do with the fact that we faked or log in here. So never mind. Let's take a look at this later. Okay, let's just not sort for now until we are back to having our application normal. All right. So actually, let's take this code here now and put it into the code that is executed when we log in. So besides this welcome message, we then also want to create the current date. Okay, so it's back to the original now. Let's now log in. And then we get the message here and the correct date. But now what I wanted to show you is what happens when we request a loan. So you see that we get this error here, right? And that's because this movement doesn't have any date, right? And that's why we get not a number in all the three values. So we need to fix that. So essentially, whenever there is a new transfer or a new loan, we need to not only push the new value into the movements array, but also into the movement dates. All right. So let's actually see that in code. So that's account 1. And so we see that the movements has now 9 elements, while the dates only has 8. All right. So we need to fix that. So let's come here to the transfer. And then besides doing the transfer and updating the UI, we also need to add transfer date. But that's easy enough. All we have to do is current account dot movement dates dot push, and then simply create the current date. So new date, and that's it. So JavaScript will then automatically convert this date here into a nicely formatted string. All right. And now the same here also for the receiver, because the receiver also gets a new movement here. Okay. And so they also need a new date for that movement. Now, as I told you also in the last section at the beginning of the project, in the real world, we would probably have an object for each movement. And so that object would then contain the amount, the date, and some other information about the movement. But I don't want to restructure the entire application now, and so therefore I simply created this separate movements dates array. All right. Now let's just take this here and also add it to the loan. So that's right here. So add loan date, and that should be it. So just to make sure here, let's really log in again. All right. And now I'm going to request this loan. And now we get the current date. So August 2nd, just as we have it up here. Okay. So let's see now the account. So account 1. Let's take a look at the movement dates. And so indeed, this is the one, or actually this is the one that I just added. So this looks a little bit different from these ones, because actually it is really the object itself. All right, so that's not good. So let's instead use the toISO string right here on the date and do the same also up here. Okay, and let's see if that fixes it then. Okay, so probably there was some error here because we're back to having not a number. And, oh, actually I need to take a look at account 1 now again. And so let's check out the latest date. Oh, and I didn't call the method. Ah, that was stupid. Actually, this is something that happens to me quite frequently with these date methods, because we don't have to pass anything in there. And so there's a tendency to forget that we even need to call the method. So don't make that same mistake. All right, and now it works indeed. So let's check if the string looks nice with the same format as all the others. And yeah, it does. And so with this, we finished one more lecture. Now here, I'm actually seeing something weird. So it's 19.1, but this should kind of be 0.1, shouldn't it? So we need to apply some padding to that as well. So that's a good coincidence that we are just at this time where I can see this. So let's go ahead quickly and fix that right here in the login callback. So that's here. And so essentially what we just need to do is to add this part to the hour and to the minute. So we make all of them a template literal again. And then like this. One more time. Now, okay, to see the effect, we need to log in. And beautiful. So that's a lot better. And now we indeed finished this lecture and are ready to move on to the next one, where we're going to work just a little bit more with dates. Let's now perform some operations with dates. So one cool thing that we can do with dates is to do calculations with them. For example, we can subtract one date from another date in order to calculate how many days have passed between the two dates. And this works because whenever we attempt to convert a date to a number, then the result is going to be the timestamp in milliseconds. And with these milliseconds, we can then perform calculations. So again, the timestamps are going to be really helpful here in this situation. So let's get this date here. Okay, and let me just demonstrate what I just said. So I will convert to a number this future. So you see, it worked. And the same thing is going to happen when I use the plus operator on it. So you see, and so in fact, that does mean we can now do operations with it. So if we subtract one date from another, the result is going to be a number like this, so a timestamp in milliseconds, and then we can simply convert these milliseconds back to days, or to hours, or to whatever we really want. So let's actually now create a function that takes in two dates, and it's going to return the number of days that pass between these two dates. So days passed is going to be a function, or let's use an arrow function. So a nice one-liner. So date 1 and date 2. And then all we need to do is date 2 minus date 1. And so let's suppose that date 2 is later. But in case we do not want to suppose that, we can simply take the absolute value here. And then it doesn't matter which of the dates here happened first in time. But for now, let's keep it like this so I can show you later what I mean. So for now, let's actually also return this result. And then I will just call this function here. So calc, or actually it's just called, well, it should be called calc. So this looks a bit nicer. So calc days passed. And then let's just create 2 dates here. So let's use this one here, maybe make it a little bit simpler. Let's say here April 14th. So this is the first date, the first that happens in time. And then the second date, let's just say, well, April 24th. So this then makes it easy for us to visualize the result. And let's just call this const days1 and then log it to the console. All right. And so this gives us these milliseconds. And so now we just need to convert them. And this is similar to what we did, I think, in one of the previous lectures. So we want to divide by 1000. And so this converts milliseconds to seconds. Then that times 60 to convert it to minutes. Then times 60 to convert it to hours. And then times 24, which converts it to days. And again, that's because there are 24 hours in a day. There are 60 minutes in 1 hour, 60 seconds in 1 minute, and 1000 milliseconds in 1 second. And so now we get 10 days. And that makes sense, right? So from April 24 to April 14, we have exactly 10 days. Now what if here we pass 4? So now it's going to be the other way around, right? So now we have -10, but we don't want that. We always want it to be 4. And so that's what I meant earlier, where we can now simply take the absolute value of this. So math.absolute. Which of the dates we pass in first. So if we now put 4 here and 14 here, then the result is still going to be 10. Great. So this works just really nice. Now, if you need really precise calculations, for example, including time changes due to daylight saving changes and other weird edge cases like that, then you should use a date library like moment.js. And that's a library that's available for free for all JavaScript developers. But for something simple like this, we should be fine. Now let's just consider that one of these days here also has some time. So let's say in this one here, it's also 10 in the morning or 10 hours and 8 minutes. Doesn't really matter. But let's see what happens to the days now. And so indeed, we now get 10.4. So we might not want that. And in this case, we can simply use math.round on all of this. Okay, so keep that in mind, but I will just leave it like this. All right, and now let's actually use this function to format and display our dates in a little bit nicer way here in our application. So basically what I want to do is if one movement happened today, then here instead of the current date, I want to display today. Then if it happened yesterday, I want to write yesterday. And then if it happened like a couple of days ago, then I want this to say like 2 days ago or 5 days ago instead of the date. And I'm sure you have seen this kind of stuff in many web applications that you use in your daily life. For example, if you post something on Facebook and if you then watch it the next day, it will say that you posted it yesterday. It's not going to display the exact date if it was just yesterday. And so that's a really nice use case of using a function like this. So let's grab this here. So I'm copying it. And then let's go to the display movements function where we do actually print the date. Now this is all kind of getting out of hand. So we have a lot of extra code here. And now we will add even more. So this function here and even some more stuff. And so let's take all of this here and actually create a new function which will have the purpose of formatting this. All right. So let's cut this here, as I just said, and create a function up here just to make it a little bit more modular. All right. And then we could also reuse this function in some other place, even though right now, in this case, we don't need it. I'm just doing this to split up the functionality a little bit across different places in our code. Okay. So this one receives a date as an input, and it will return the formatted date then. Okay. So I'm copying all of this, but actually this one should stay back here where we got it from. And then also, so this, we need this variable back here where it came from. So display date, because we use it down here as the value that we eventually want to print to the user interface. And so this one should actually be the result of calling our new function. So this format movement date. So format movement date, and here we pass in the date variable that we just created up here. All right, and so with this, we just exported the functionality here into a new function. So let's grab this and put it here at the top of the scope. And so for now, just to keep this working, let's return then this value. All right, and as you see, and let's just make sure by logging in. So as you see, the dates are now still being correctly printed. So we successfully exported this functionality here of displaying the dates into this function. And now we can just implement what I just said. So basically calculating how many days passed since the current date and between the date that we are working with. All right. So let's say const days passed and between. So between right now, that is new date. And then the second date is the date that we just received here. So let's just print this to the console to see if it works. Okay. So what's all of this here? So we are printing here actually the wrong thing. So we want days passed. So that was a mistake, obviously. But it's still not correct. And okay, I have another mistake. So probably you saw this already. So I did not even call the calc days passed function. But now it should be good. And indeed, now we have our days here. All right. And now let's actually round them. Okay, so that's what I was just saying earlier, so that we should probably round these dates. So we already learned how to do that. So math.round all of this. And so this looks a lot better now. Now let's actually modify our dates here a little bit. And you should do the same. And what I'm going to do is to make one date yesterday, and then also a date like 3 or 4 days ago. So see what's your current date, and then simply subtract 1. So for me, it's August 2nd. So I'm going to use August 1st. And then also July 28th. And maybe another July here, 25, or maybe 26. Okay, it's just so that we can see like the yesterday or 3 days ago or something like that. All right, so do that now. And then let's go back here to our function. And then we want to implement some logic based on this day passed. So if days passed is 0, and so basically that is if we do something today, then actually the string that we want to print is not the current date, but instead today. All right. Then if 1 day has passed, we want to return yesterday. Okay. Next up, if, well, let's say if the number of days passed is within the last week. So that's less or equal 7. And then we will return the number of days. So days passed, days ago, and else. So only if more than 7 days have passed, only then we want to return the actual date. Okay, does that make sense? So let's save and see if it works. And yes, beautiful. So that's yesterday, 5 days ago, 7 days ago, and then here the other dates right here. So that's beautiful, great. Let's now just do something. And actually let's transfer like 500 to Jessica Davis. And that's gonna be the other way around. Jessica Davis 500. And so now we should get one log here with today. Yes, indeed, there is today. And now if we log in as Jessica Davis, we should get the same. So now we have a deposit coming from today. And actually we also have something from 7 days ago. So great, that's amazing if you ask me, that we are capable of now doing something like this, which looks like a real web application that you might use every day. All right. Now, maybe the logic here is a bit confusing with all of these returns, but that's completely normal. So as you know, once we return, the function stops executing. And so these other returns will then never be reached. And so this is a pretty common technique. And actually, we wouldn't even need this else. So if I just remove this here, then all of this code will only be executed if all of these here are not executed. So only if all of these here are false, the rest of the code is even executed. So you see it works the exact same way. Awesome. So our application is even better now. And in the next 2 lectures, we will then do what I mentioned earlier, which is internationalization, which is to basically format these dates and also these numbers here according to each of the countries of these accounts. So JavaScript has a new internationalization API. Now that sounds very fancy, but all it does is to allow us to easily format numbers and strings according to different languages. So with this new API, we can make our application support different languages for users around the world, which is pretty important. For example, currencies or dates are represented in a completely different way in Europe or in the US or in Asia, for example. Now, there is a lot of language-specific things that we can do with the internationalization API. But in this section, we're just briefly going to talk about formatting dates and numbers. And starting with dates in this video. So in our application, we have dates in 2 places. First right here, and then second here in each of these movements. Now, in case you're wondering why these labels like today or yesterday or 5 days ago are gone here from my application, it's just because I'm recording this video a couple of days later. All right. But anyway, let's go to the place in our code which displays this first date here, so that we can format that according to different languages and see what it looks like. And so that is right here in the login handler function. And in particular, this is the code that we have currently. Remember doing this? But now we will actually be able to get rid of all of this and simply replace it with the internationalization API. So it will do this kind of formatting for us automatically. But for now, let's actually display this date here outside of the login so that we can experiment a little bit with this API without having to log in all the time. So I will grab the current date. experimenting with the API. Okay. And then we also need to get just this part where we do then actually display something in the DOM, right? So we want to set this text content property here to something. And we want to set it to a formatted date. And so let's now use the internationalization API for that. So that's new. And then Intl. And so that's basically the namespace for the internationalization API. And then for times and dates, we use the .date time format function. Okay. Now all that we need to pass into this function here is a so-called local string. And this local is usually the language and then dash the country. So something like this. So English and then dash US, for example. All right. And so all of this here will create a so-called formatter for this language in this country. So English.us. And I will show you a list of many different locales here in a second. But for now, let's get started with this one. So all of this creates a new formatter. And then on that formatter, we can call .format. All right. And then here we actually pass in the date that we want to format. So that's now. And that's actually it. So let's reload here. And you see that now the date is actually formatted just like it is usually formatted in the US, with the month first and then the day. Now English is also spoken in other languages. So let's try the UK now, or Great Britain. So for the UK, we have to use this one. And now you see that it is different. So you have the day first, then the month, and it also has this leading 0 here. And so you see that now it is actually formatting this date for this exact locale that we specified here. And so just with this one line of code, we have correctly formatted the date for any user around the world. And let's try some other countries here as well. For example, we could try Arabic for Syria. So that would look like this. So in these symbols that I cannot really understand, but what matters is that it is indeed formatted correctly. Let's just put it back here. All right. And to get these different codes, let's just Google ISO language code table. And then the one that's easiest to understand is this one here. So go to the one that has lingos.net, and then from there you can find your own code and then experiment with that and see if it's also correct. All right. Now this is the most straightforward way of formatting dates and times, but we can actually take it to the next level and add some options to also customize this a little bit. For example, you see that right now it only displays the date here, but not any time, right? And so we can change that by providing an options object to this function here. So let's define that options object outside here. And I'm simply calling it options. And so all we have to do is to specify the hours property, or hour, and set it to numeric. And the same for the minute, set it to numeric as well. And now we have to then provide this object here as a second argument into the date time format function. So options. And of course we could have written this object right here, but I will add some more stuff to it in a second. And then this line of code here becomes a little bit messy. So it's quite usual to have a configuration object like this one here defined outside. So, as you see, now we get indeed the time. But on the other hand, now the date is gone. So let's get that back as well. And here we can specify properties for each of weekday, year, month, and day. So let's start with the day, and I will set it to numeric as well. So let's see what happens then. And so now we only get the day. Let's add the month as well. Numeric again. And so now we get the month here as 8. Okay, and that's because we specified it as numeric. But for month, we can also write long. So let's see what happens then. And so now we get August, and so not just the number. And for the month, there is even another option, which is 2-digit. And so then it would be 08. But let's leave it at long. And now the year as well. Let's set it to numeric. And of course in quotes. All right. So that's 2020. But we could also say just 2-digit. And so then it would be 20. But again, let's leave it as numeric. And finally, we can even specify the weekday. And here I'm using long again. And so then it will write out the day completely. So Wednesday, August 12, 2020. And all of this nicely formatted, just like people in the US do it. All right. Now here we can also say short or narrow, and you can experiment with that. So let's see what it would look like in the UK. So that's pretty similar. But now let's see, for example, Portugal. So PT-PT. And so now you will see this here, of course, written all in Portuguese. And the same, of course, for other locales, so for other languages. Now, in many situations, it actually makes more sense to not define the locale manually, but instead to simply get it from the user's browser. And so that's pretty easy to do as well. So let's define another variable here outside. So locale, and then that's simply navigator dot language. So let's log it here to the console first. So you see that mine here is set to English, Great Britain. And so if I replace this here now, then you will see that it will go back here to displaying it in English. All right. And so if you do this yourself now, then your date should be displayed to whatever language you have in your browser. Anyway, let's now take this and actually put it here into our login. So replacing all of this, I will just comment it out to leave it here. And now we have a duplicate here. Let's get rid of that. So now the date will only get formatted when the user actually logs in. All right. But now let's take a look at our account objects here. And so you see that now in each of the accounts, I defined a locale, right? So account 1 is Portuguese and the other one is in English. And so let's now actually use these locales to display Jonas's date here in the Portuguese format and Jessica's date in the American format. Okay, so that's easy enough. We just have to find the correct place in our code. So yeah, that's right here. And remember that we have the account in the current account variable. And so here, instead of using this locale that's coming from the browser, so instead of using this, we use current account.locale. So let's give it a save. And now I will log in as Jonas. And remember, that should now display in the Portuguese format. And indeed, it does. Now the problem here is that our entire user interface is in English, but now I have this weekday here in Portuguese and also this month name. So to fix that, let's actually set the month here back to numeric and also get entirely rid of the weekday. So let's try that again. So we got rid of the Portuguese words here, but the formatting still follows the official Portuguese way. Now let's check out Jessica Davis. And so you see it looks different now. It is now in the American format with the month first and then also with the AM time down here. And of course you can set one of these accounts to your own language to see how it would look like in your language to make it a little bit more personalized for yourself. Great. So with this we have localized this date here. Now we need to do the same with the dates down here in the movements. So let's go to that function which formats these dates. Remember we created a function for that up here. So that is format movement date. Okay. Again, let's now do this formatting here also for these movements. And so what we're going to do is to replace all of this here with a new nicely formatted date. So instead of returning all of this here like we did before, we will simply return new and then again the intl namespace date time format, and then here we need the locale, and so let's actually pass that into the function. All right, so this function right now only receives a date, but we also now need a locale. So let's add that here as a second parameter. And now wherever we call this function, and that is down here, so here we now need to pass in that locale, of course. And so that comes from the account.locale. So the current account in here is called ACC, remember? And so that locale is at acc.locale. All right. So return new date format and then simply the locale that we receive here. And then format the date. And so that's again the date that we receive as an input here. Okay, and that's it. And in this case, we don't want any options object because here we don't need the hours or the minutes. All we want is to simply display the date as simple as possible. And in that case, we don't even need any options. So let's give it a save here. Try it now with Jessica Davis. And you see that indeed, now it is the American format with the month first like this. Let's just transfer some money here to Jonas. And so of course here our today still works. So these kind of easier to read and understand labels that I showed you earlier. So that is the American format. And now let's again see Jonas format, which should now change to the Portuguese one. And indeed, it did. And so this part is now working as well. Great. So in a nutshell, this is how we localize dates in JavaScript using the new internationalization API. And as always, feel free to read the documentation on MDN. So that's just MDN Intl. And so here you're going to find all kinds of different functions. So I mentioned in the beginning that there's all kinds of stuff we can do with this API. So besides dates, so we can also format lists or like words and their plurals. All right. But if you want to learn about this one a little bit better that we just used, you can go ahead and read the documentation right here. In the next video, we will use this number format function here to format all the remaining numbers that we have in our application. So let's move on and do that now.